Hello, and a very warm welcome to this webinar, which marks the publication of a new edited collection from the IOE, Transforming Early Childhood Education in England Towards a Democratic Education. My name is Sue Rogers, Interim Director of the IOE, but I also have a particular interest in early years education, so I'm especially pleased to be chairing this event. The book builds on the Institute's long-standing and distinguished work in early childhood education and care, stemming back to the work of Susan Isaacs in the 1930s. It's edited by Professor Claire Cameron and Emeritus Professor Peter Moss of the IOE's Thomas Coram Research Unit, part of the Social Research Institute, a department of the IOE. It brings together 18 academics at or associated with the IOE to put forward a bold manifesto for change. You'll have seen the link to the book in the event information. I'm really pleased it's free to read online as an open access publication to ensure wide reach and engagement across national, international communities. Today, the editors will share some of the main conclusions and recommendations. That will be followed by inputs from the authors of 2 chapters, Diana Sousa and Carmen Dalli, to illustrate overarching themes from the book, the case for democratic education and workforce transformation. Being on a very different time zone over in New Zealand, Carmen has kindly provided her comments via a recording. Then for our final segment, we will have the chance to put your comments and questions to an expert panel, including Claire and Peter, plus I'm delighted to say Sara Bonetti from the Education Policy Institute and Beatrice Merrick from Early Education. We're really keen to hear from audience members throughout this webinar so that your inputs become part of the event and the recording that we will post afterwards. Please use the YouTube chat function to share your thoughts and to put questions to the panel for the question and answer segment. You can also tweet about the event if you wish. With that, let me say I hope you enjoy the proceedings. I'm certain it will stimulate much debate and discussion. And so I'll hand over to Claire and Peter to talk us through their manifesto for early years reform.
Hello to everybody, and thank you all for joining us today. Transforming Early Childhood in England, this new book, is a book to provoke critical reflection, to stimulate widespread debate, and to arouse hope that something better is both necessary and possible, a hope that is especially important in this time of crisis. As the Indian writer Arundhati Roy puts it, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal and a gateway between one world and the next. Introducing the book, some definitions are called for. Slide, please. By early childhood, we mean early childhood education and care services for children from birth to compulsory school age, though what that age should be is a question we'll return to. And it includes childminders, preschools, nurseries, nursery schools, nursery and reception classes, and children's centres. But we also cover other policy areas that have a major bearing on young children and their families, including income support and health and housing and parenting leave. By taking this broad view, we situate early childhood education and care as an essential part of a larger welfare state. But as we write today, that welfare state has become threadbare, failing to prevent the lives of many young children and families from being blighted by poverty, insecurity, poor housing and homelessness. Our focus is on England, though we think our analysis of both problems and solutions has relevance for other parts of the UK and for many countries beyond, especially in the English-speaking world. And finally, by transforming, we mean that yet more tweaking, more rearranging the deck chairs is quite insufficient to the scale of the challenge. Fundamental change, transformational change is needed in structures, in practices, and most important of all, in thinking. Like many others, we see 1997 as a turning point for early childhood education and care in England. After decades of policy neglect, early childhood education and care became a policy priority. But we also see 1997 as a missed opportunity. Those prior decades of neglect meant that by 1997, services had accumulated many deep-seated problems. But government then and since has failed to tackle these problems, preferring to put sticking plasters on a deeply flawed system rather than conduct a thorough diagnosis and effective course of treatment. Indeed, in many respects, government action since 1997 has made matters worse rather than better. So the core message of our book is this. Slide, please. The system of early childhood education and care in England does not work for children or parents, workers or society. Nothing short of transformation is now needed to give young children the all-round upbringing they have a right to, and parents the support they need to both work and care. So before we turn to look at possibilities for change and what transformation might mean, Claire will run us through some of the main failings of early childhood in England today.
Thanks, Peter. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to have you all with us today. So the public spend on early childhood education and care today is about 0.6% of GDP versus 1.6% in Sweden and 0.9% in New Zealand. That's a rather staggering contrast. And we've picked these two countries not only because they do early childhood education quite well, and because we include examples from these two countries in our book. And indeed, later on, we'll hear from New Zealand case. Access, we have 93% of our 3 and 4-year-olds accessing some form of early childhood care today, and 40% of our under 3s. But we should stress that it's only free in term time and for a set number of hours for 3 and 4-year-olds. So there are funded access. There's 69% of an estimate of 69% of eligible 2-year-olds get some kind of early childhood education. So that means 30% don't. And fees to parents are very high in England. It's £124 a week for 25 hours for a 2-year-old versus £130 a month for the more affluent families in Sweden. That's a staggering difference. Also comparing Sweden and the UK, we can see that social background shapes access. In Sweden, while 51% of children under 3 attend, the rate in the UK was 28.5%. Among low-income groups, 42% in Sweden attended compared to 17% in the UK. And so the difference is much less among the more affluent, 50% in Sweden and 42% in the UK. So next slide. In 1997, early childhood education became a policy priority, as Peter said. Spending went up considerably. Early childhood education was made a universal offer for 3 and 4-year-olds. The private sector was encouraged to provide childcare, and multi-agency children's centres were inaugurated. And these Sure Start centres were aimed at narrowing the attainment gap between children living in poverty and others. And these 3 measures were designed to improve family resources through mothers' employment, as well as increasing the proportion of children who are ready to school at age 5. But the great fault line in early childhood education was and is childcare on the one hand and education on the other. Successive governments have only partially resolved this split, and now childcare is the dominant theme, as can be seen in government papers called, for example, More Great Childcare, More Affordable Childcare, and policy measures such as in 2017 to introduce 30 hours of free childcare for 3 and 4-year-olds with working parents. So the result is that the education part of early childhood education has become somewhat diminished. The early years foundation stage curriculum was introduced to provide a coherence against split organisational arrangements. And initially it won praise for its holistic and child-centred approach, but it's become more narrowly focused on school readiness and implemented by staff with a wide range of qualifications and backgrounds. There continues to be school-based provision for 3 and 4-year-olds and some 2-year-olds in schools and classes. There's care provision in day nurseries and childminders. But the network of 3,500 holistically framed children's centres established in the 2000s have reduced in number and become targeted on the socially disadvantaged. And finally, while there have been moves to integrate administrative responsibility, for example, into the Department for Education, the post-1997 project of integration has largely stalled, and the split has widened, especially in relation to funding systems, which have grown ever more complex. And then there's the workforce. We have an estimated 363,400 staff working with young children in schools, group settings, and home-based settings. And that workforce remains split between teachers who are better paid and better qualified, and childcare workers who are lower paid with lower qualifications and no clear occupational identity. There's no one equivalent term to teacher, for example, among childcare workers. The qualifications split is quite stark. So among those working in childcare, only a quarter have a degree level qualification and a third have a qualification equivalent to A levels. But under teachers is a graduate profession, so they all have bachelor level qualifications. And the proposal, the measures under the Labour government to introduce graduate teachers into every class has become diluted. What's more, as Sara Bonetti has shown, the proportion of qualified staff in any one setting is decreasing, and there's a striking increase in reliance on unpaid volunteers and students. So there's pay differences. Teachers are paid around £18 an hour, while childcare workers are paid an average of £8.20 an hour. And there's high turnover, around 20%. Workplace stress is now common in education settings. We don't know about the well-being of staff in early childhood education, but one sector-organised survey found that 3/4 of respondents were regularly stressed, especially by the volume of paperwork and lack of resources. And this degree of stress may well have an impact on the interpersonal relationships and communicative language learning children enjoy in early childhood education provision. So next slide, please. The private sector is a clear player in the England system. So 80% of early childhood education and care places are not in primary or nursery schools, but are in group settings in the private or voluntary sector or in childminding. And last year in 2019, fewer than 10% of places in nurseries were delivered by non-profit organisations, and more than half by large chains. So Ava Lloyd argues that these large chains are pursuing ambitious expansion plans in a global market. But these businesses don't provide sector stability. Even before the pandemic struck, Ofsted reported that between April 2018 and March 2019, more than 550 childcare providers were closed for business in England each month. So private sector provision is absorbing public money, but not enough to pay staff well or reduce costs to parents. And in the current era of COVID, private childcare is looking increasingly financially vulnerable and out of reach for children of low and middle income families. Ava Lloyd shows that government funding to support access is insufficient for nurseries who charge top-up fees. And parental employment rates are likely to also increase the removal of children from early childhood education settings. And this is in addition to the very real threats to the access to maintain nursery schools due to systematic underfunding. And apart from all these barriers, some children are missing out in particular, and those are children with special educational needs. So the private sector provision is reporting cutting back on staff training, pay, resources and food for children in an attempt to address the funding gap between government support and the fees charged to parents. This is also in the context of the role of local authorities having been weakened. So collaboration and innovation across centres is reduced or non-existent since they operate in a competitive market. Centralised control of funding and pedagogy through government departments and regulatory bodies also decreases the way in which local authorities can support on a localised basis. And there's a competitive tone between settings also through the pedagogical culture of targets and measurement and school readiness. So I've just included a couple of quotes from the newspapers about the collapse, the prospective collapse in the childcare sector and the funding cuts. And the final slide, next please, is about the social context of families' lives. So our chapters in our book document the over 4 million children are living in poverty, and their expectations that this will rise in the pandemic. Poverty is associated with poor outcomes related to learning, behaviour and health, as our chapter by Abigail Knight and colleagues points out. And the UN rapporteur in 2018 described the way that the policies, welfare benefits of this country that drive down claiming entitlements and attract stigma and shame, that these deprive young children of support, and it was called an often callous approach. One of our chapters by Diana Rosenthal documents that homelessness, about 750,000 children is an estimate, and housing security are associated with poor health outcomes, such as asthma, diabetes, poor mental health and disability, and also infectious diseases through poor uptakes of vaccines. And finally, parental leave. Compared to the best policies in the world, those in England pay mothers and fathers at a low rate and for insufficient periods of time to allow realistic and sustained family leave. So this is a very gloomy picture, but the book is also about hope. And so in the next part of the presentation, Peter's going to introduce us to a transformed early childhood education and care system.
Thank you very much, Claire. I think it's very important to stress that our critique, and it's a strong critique, is of the system and not of the people who are doing their best under difficult circumstances and working in services. We are focused on a bad system, not on the people who are working in it. The core message of the book is that transformation of early childhood in England is both necessary and possible. A transformation that is part of renewing the welfare state and rebuilding our country's depleted social infrastructure. We'll focus now on one part of that renewal and rebuilding early childhood education. And I'll offer a broad picture of what we propose, while Claire will fill in some of the detail, imagining what a transformed early childhood education might mean in practice for actual children and parents and workers. But before doing that, I want to stress that our proposals are not mere wishful thinking. They're based on very firm foundations. For example, children's rights are set out in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Experience and research from both home and abroad, including countries like Denmark, New Zealand, Italy, Norway, Portugal, and Sweden. And the contribution, as Sue has already said, from 18 experts at or associated with the Institute of Education. So what is the broad picture of transformation that the book offers? Slide, please. It proposes... Next slide. It proposes a public system of early childhood education that is fully integrated, covering not only policy making and administration, curriculum and regulation, but also access, funding, workforce and type of provision. This integrated public system would be available as of right for children from birth to 6 years and to their carers, combined with 12 months of well-paid maternity and parental leave, with at least 4 months only for fathers and 4 months only for mothers. We see early childhood education and parental leave needing to be in synergy, meaning to be integrated very closely. The integrated public system would be provided through a network of fully integrated, multi-purpose and community-based children's centres, providing education to all children, plus a range of other services for children and families. Transformation would be based on children's centres. An integrated public system would be staffed by graduate professionals specialising in work with children from birth to 6 years and having parity of status and conditions with compulsory school teachers and accounting for at least 60% of staff working directly with children. a graduate workforce, not just a graduate leadership. It would be recognised as the first stage of the education system, with primary and compulsory education starting at age 6. The present age starting at 5 is far too young. It would be free to attend for a core period equivalent to normal school hours in the compulsory education system. New slide, please. It would be closely connected to local authorities who would have a rejuvenated role in planning, coordination and support, as well as providing some children's centres alongside non-profit private providers. It would be funded directly, not via subsidies paid to parents, and it would be built on values of participatory democracy, cooperation and solidarity. What we propose, and this is really important, is a system that is first and foremost educational, an early childhood education with no more talk of childcare services or childcare workers, which doesn't mean ignoring the needs of employed parents. They are recognised in generous opening hours and reformed parental leave. Nor is care jettisoned, but rather than childcare for working parents, we believe all children and adults require care. Care understood as an ethic that defines how children and adults should relate to each other. Early childhood education with an ethic of care. The transformation goes beyond systems and structures, important as these are. New slide, please. It also encompasses pedagogical principles, values and practices, including working with an image of the rich child born with great potential in 100 languages, adopting concepts of slow knowledge, slow thinking and slow pedagogy, allowing time to linger, reflect and revisit. Observation and documentation, particularly pedagogical documentation, to play a central role, enabling all learning of all children to become visible and valued. And assessment as a cooperative and dynamic process embedded in everyday educational experience, turning away from managerial accounting towards a democratic accountability. Now, that's a lot to take in one short sitting, and the book, of course, goes into much more detail about what all this would mean and also how to do it. But to give some idea of what all this might look like in practice, I'll hand over for the last leg to Claire.
Thanks, Peter. Next slide, please. In this final section, I want to give life to the ideas in the book by inviting you to imagine a new family with their first child. This is a time for employment and citizenship rights to support society's aim to bring up children in healthy and happy environments. Those in employment, whether precarious or permanent, are able to access well-supported parental leave until the end of the first year of a child's life, with fathers able to access, as Peter said, at least 4 months of parental leave, paid at a rate that does not force parents to resume employment early. Political action acknowledges the health impacts of poverty, and salaries and welfare benefits are paid at a rate that enables young families to feed their families adequately. Secure and decent housing is available as of right to new parents to avoid long-term chronic health problems associated with poverty and poor housing, such as asthma, diabetes, infectious diseases, mental health difficulties, and cognitive development. At about 12 years of age, the child, we'll call her Rose, starts her early education at a local publicly supported children's centre within walking distance of her home. Next slide, please. The family is already familiar with the centre as it is, along with all other centres, collaborative with other local community groups, and offers a wide range of activities and advice for parents and babies and children of all ages. There may even be a cafe that acts as a social hub for the local community. The leader and about half the staff hold a recognised qualification, such as a bachelor degree in social pedagogy that combines theoretical and practical preparation in education, care and upbringing, and both pedagogical and organisational knowledge. And health and specialist support services are available for parents to consult and for the ECEC staff to refer to when needed. Next slide, please. While opening longer hours to cater for employment hours, Rose attends the core day with a small group of other children of a similar age, with plentiful access to beautiful spaces, indoor and out. And I should say here, we're indebted to Kate Cowan and Branch and Bone for the photos in this presentation. Rose can direct her own learning with carefully chosen stimulating materials and furnishings. There are no predetermined checklists of what she should have to have learned by what age, but a constant interaction with her at her own level and in the context of her own life. Staff are trained to recognise her learning disposition or the way she shows her interest, participates in the centre, persists with difficulty, and communicates with others. They follow a culturally relevant and broad curricula, such as the Te Whariki in New Zealand. Rose is seen as a whole child, a whole person, and a child rich in possibilities. That is, an active learner seeking the meaning of the world from birth, a co-creator of knowledge, identity, culture, and values, a child that can live, learn, listen, and communicate, but always in relation to others. The whole child is a child with body, mind, emotions, creativity, history, and social identity, an individual whose individuality and autonomy depend on interdependence, and a citizen, a subject with rights. Furthermore, Rose's pace of life at the centre is child-centred and slow. Her sense of self-identity and belonging are reinforced by the markers of herself around the centre, her name and her picture. She's a valuable member of the centre, and her very self is sedimented into the fabric of the place. There are also imaginative spaces in the centre, free from adult-centric definitions. The social pedagogues working with Rose are not rushed. They slow down, listen hard, and discover that she transforms the meanings of spaces by introducing her own ideas, as Alison Clark's work shows. By taking a slow pedagogy approach in ECEC, perhaps using the revisiting and reflective practices adopted in the pedagogical documentation methods of Reggio Emilia, the social pedagogues can step back and think about what it is that Rose is trying to say and how she is expressing herself. New slide, please. As Rose turns 2 and 3, she stays in the same children's centre. She does not have to move settings to have access to more challenging learning environments, such as the nursery school, and the centre is flexible enough to manage her parents' changing employment patterns or her evolving special needs. Rose's parents can volunteer to support the centre through membership of a local governing board, and they can influence the programme by making suggestions about activities and skills they would like to see available or to contribute to themselves. Her parents pay fees that are low and adjusted for their circumstances, and they're subsidised by national taxation. Ava Lloyd gives Norway as an inspiring example of a mixed economy with high quality, accessible, affordable, enjoyable early childhood education that promotes the interests of children, families, the workforce, and the state. So the last slide, please. So Rose and her parents have confidence in their local children's centre because regulation exists with a well-developed role for local authorities to provide support, learning and networking opportunities for staff. A team of locally knowledgeable experts plan the services that are needed over time, collaborate across centres, harness specialist expertise, innovate pedagogies, offer therapeutic supervision, evaluate what's on offer, provide some services themselves, and promote cooperatives with other forms of collaborative democratic organisation. Staff are paid well enough, more than the minimum wage, more in line with teacher salaries. And as Rose nears the age of 6, she transfers to the local primary school and begins her formal school experience. Schools and children's centres are collaborative partners, important players in their local communities, and seen as a public good. Next slide. This last slide is an example of a combined kindergarten, cafe, and community hub from a highly diverse part of Berlin that I visited a few years ago. This is a good example of what a reformed, transformed early childhood education could be like for Rose and her parents in England. And an opportunity to visit the UCL Press website to access the book.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks to Claire and Peter for a compelling presentation and for making the case for reform. I know it's going to generate a lot of questions from our audience. I mean, what is really staggering, I think, is that you use 1997 as a landmark year, and of course it was, but we could go back before that, and we are still talking about these issues today. We will perhaps come to those with our questions. I mean, the other thing that stands out for me is that COVID has both surfaced and exacerbated inequality, and so this is a very important moment for us to take stock. A very powerful presentation at this particular point in time. So I'm not going to take up any more time at this point. I'm going to pass now to the next part of the presentations from two contributors to the book. And without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Diana Sousa, Senior Teaching Fellow at the IOE. And Diana's going to speak to us on the matter of democratic education.
Many thanks, Sue, for the introduction, and many thanks to Peter and Claire for the invitation to join you in this webinar today. It is a great pleasure and a great responsibility to be here to talk to you about democracy and to reflect upon its meanings and possible enactments in education. Quite suitably, yesterday, many international organizations celebrated the International Day of Democracy. And it goes without saying that the uncertainties and fears throughout the world brought by the current times, alongside challenges that so many children and their families are facing against their freedoms and diversities, speaking of democracy and its purposes in education in this presentation is also speaking about what makes us human. So I'm not here to talk to you about party politics. I'm here to talk to you about democracy as the real life experiences, the relationships, the exchanges, the communications, the participation, cooperation, solidarity, and sharing that we live together in education and in society. Peter and Claire already mentioned in their earlier communication that the book Transforming Early Childhood in England argues for democracy as a fundamental value for a transformed early childhood system towards a democratic education. In my very short presentation, I am going to focus my thinking on the chapter that I contributed on democracy, and I will particularly refer to the practical example offered by the modern school movement in Portugal, also known as MEM, as an example of a local cultural project which has democracy at the center of its thinking and doing education. But to begin with, I think it's really important, first of all, to stress the strong tradition of people who have not only spoken about the importance of democracy for education and society, but also who have conceptualized democracy as an inherent component of education. So in other words, I'm talking about people who viewed education and society as indissociable from each other, and who understood educational settings as spaces for relationship and socialization, and specifically of education for democratic citizenship as spaces for children and adults to voice their views about matters that affect them, and also to express their opinions and beliefs about themselves and society. Next slide, please. So two of the people I would like to mention today are the American psychologist John Dewey and the French pedagogue Célestin Freinet. And there are many reasons to speak about Dewey and Freinet together when reflecting upon democracy and education. And one of those reasons is that despite their differences, these two educationalists complement each other in more ways than one. So, for example, democracy is conceptualized by them as a value which generates conscious individuals who participate and live together in society. And as you can see in this slide, Dewey has described democratic education as a mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience, where social relationships constitute the essence of education institutions, while Freinet also argued that education and society could not exist without one another, believing that one prepares the democracy of tomorrow by democracy in the school. Next slide, please. So while Dewey is many times described as the philosopher, Freinet is by contrast often described as the teacher, the practitioner. Now, with the evident risk of oversimplifying their work with this statement, the reality is that they have distinctly contributed to understandings of democracy, both as a value and as a pedagogy. For instance, as you can perceive from the photographs in this slide, you can see how Freinet created strategies, which he called techniques, to put in practice the values that he associated with democratic education, creating in this way a democratic school which valued aspects such as diversity, heterogeneity, participation, solidarity, communication, dialogue, reflection, and cooperation as a means to transform education and society. And the reason why it's particularly important to speak about Freinet today is that his cooperative pedagogy has strongly inspired the Portuguese modern school movement that I will introduce to you next. Next slide, please. So the modern school movement in Portugal, MEM, as it's known, is a pedagogical association of teachers and other educational professionals, which emerged in the mid-1960s during a dictatorship. So because of that, MEM was only legally established in the mid-1970s following the reinstatement of democracy with the democratic revolution in Portugal in 1974. Now, unfortunately, in this presentation, I don't have enough time to tell you about the history of MEM in detail, but I do hope that you feel encouraged to read more about it in the chapter, because the social, cultural, and political events that inspire the emergence of a movement like MEM are fundamental to understand its missions. I can, however, give you a strong indication of what MEM is about by telling you that this movement follows core principles such as cooperation, solidarity, social, cultural integration, and initiation to democratic practices. And what I mean by this is that in MEM, children and adults have the right and the responsibility to actively participate in the construction of an inclusive and democratic school culture. Now, this obviously takes many different forms, some of which I will refer to you as the presentation progresses. Next slide, please. So, what am I talking about? What is MEM in reality? So MEM is a democratic cooperative school culture that is materialized and humanized within the participatory co-construction of knowledge, which results from the relationships and interactions between children, adults, and the community. In other words, MEM is a pedagogical movement which supports teacher education and pedagogical practice in different sectors of education, from early childhood to higher education. And it's important here to highlight that in MEM, education is defined in broad terms. So education is defined as a shared journey towards an active democratic citizenship where everyone teaches and everyone learns. Next slide, please. So just to explain MEM's relevance, its relevance emerges from the fact that first, this is a national movement. So it is organized in regional centers, it's spread across most of the country, and it currently has a membership of more than 2,000 professionals. It is also a transsectoral and intergenerational movement. In other words, it's a movement that is committed to the integration of democratic values in the life of school across different educational sectors, again, from early childhood to higher education. It is officially recognized by the government as a national institution that contributes to public education. So it has been defined, for example, as a collective of public utility and as an honorary member of the Order of Public Instruction, which is related to state education. And it is also, and very importantly, strategically organized into processes of permanent dialogic action. And what I mean by this is that MEM involves people in processes of constant reflection within the context of interaction between the cooperative education of teachers and their pedagogical practice. So teachers and other educational professionals are offered with formal and informal situations for learning, reflecting and creating pedagogical tools. So in practice, educational professionals from all sectors of education organize regular meetings and encounters, both at regional and national levels, to engage in activities which contribute to the continuous professional development. So these encounters serve the purpose of learning and reflecting upon pedagogical practice, discussing new methodologies, analyzing and sharing experiences, and exchanging knowledges. And finally, MEM is a living pedagogy. It's a pedagogy that fosters the democratic character and the social moral development of children and adults by ensuring that they all fully participate in the conjoint cooperative management of the curriculum. So this means that children, students in general, have the responsibility to work collaboratively with their teachers in the planning of curricular activities, to engage in research, participate in projects, and contribute to the evaluation of their own work. Final slide, please. So finally, to end my brief presentation, I hope that as an organic and dynamic democratic project, which is constantly evolving and changing, you can see in MEM the potential for democratic alternatives in education. Although MEM has emerged from specific social, cultural, historical, and political conditions, it shows that we can think about education as a democratic project which is focused in the construction of the future. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Diana, for another really powerful presentation. And concepts like community and participation, I think, are developing as themes throughout today. And I'm sure we'll come back to that in the questions. But at this point, I'm going to move over now and introduce our speaker from New Zealand, Carmen Dalli, who is going to talk to us about the early years workforce, a recorded contribution. Carmen is Professor of Early Childhood Education at Victoria, University of Wellington. Can we move on to Carmen's presentation now? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to Peter and Claire for inviting me to join you at this watershed moment in early childhood policy in England, as elsewhere. COVID lockdowns everywhere have revealed how essential early childhood services are for the well-being of families and societies. So in calling for transformation, this is a very timely book. It's a call to arms for all of us. And most importantly, it calls on policymakers to commit to change and to safeguard the changes so that they are not easy to unravel. Just a bit of background about New Zealand. Aotearoa, New Zealand is a small country, geographically 10% bigger than the UK, but with a much smaller population of 4.8 million. 15% identify as Maori. Aotearoa is the Maori name for the country, and using the two names is the political statement that acknowledges the original people of the land, the Tangata Whenua, Maori. In terms of early childhood context, it's a very diverse sector. We've got over 20 different types of early childhood services, varying by philosophy, governance, structure, ownership, hours of opening, and so on. And for administrative and funding purposes, we divide services into two types, teacher-led or parent-led. For example, play centers and indigenous kohangareo, the Maori language nets, which are run by parents. All licensed centers, regardless of ownership or structure, must meet the same standards by regulation. New Zealand has had an integrated care and education system since 1986, when the policy responsibility for childcare was moved from the Department of Social Welfare to Education. We have high participation rates. 94.9% of children who started school last year attended some form of early childhood service. And participation continues to grow, with the biggest enrollment growth for 0 to 2-year-olds. School is compulsory from the age of 6, but most children start school on the day they turn 5. Creating a graduate early childhood teacher workforce has been central to the major reforms in the early childhood system in New Zealand over the last 30 years. Virtually all teacher-led services have 80% of their staff who are qualified teachers. Across the total early childhood workforce, and that includes parent-led ones, 68% are qualified teachers. Unqualified staff work alongside qualified, but are paid at a lower rate. In some centres, and that's mainly kindergartens, early childhood teachers have pay parity with primary school teachers. The role of the early childhood teacher is a holistic role. Early childhood teacher education prepares students to work with children aged 0 to 5 years, irrespective of the part of the early childhood sector they work in. Teacher education programs position education and care as inseparable and as happening in partnership with parents. There have been two key turning points in early childhood policy leading to the integration and creation of a graduate early childhood workforce. One was the introduction in 1987 of a 3-year integrated diploma level training for work in childcare and kindergarten. And the second turning point was a 10-year strategic plan in 2002. So I'll step through these turning points and then touch briefly on current issues. Introducing an integrated 3-year undergraduate diploma of early childhood teaching in colleges of education established a unified benchmark qualification with pathways from different types of training. An implementation committee within each teacher's college with sector representation ensured a core curriculum across all programs. When teachers' colleges merged with University Department of Education in the 90s, the diplomas were upgraded to bachelor degrees. And it was at that point that early childhood teaching in New Zealand turned into a graduate profession. For the last 15 years, we've also had graduate diplomas of teaching. So that's 1 year of early childhood teacher education on top of any undergraduate degree. The majority of early childhood teachers now enter the workforce with a 3-year degree or a 1-year graduate diploma. There were important consequences from integrated training for the professionalization of the early childhood workforce. Firstly, it shifted the terminology away from childcare and preschool to the more inclusive term of early childhood education and care, and we dropped the terms childcare worker in favor of teacher. Staff without a diploma could have their training background and experience evaluated by the New Zealand Qualifications Authority using a points-based system. Tertiary institutions then developed 3 different pathways of study that could be tailored to a student's individual training needs. Additionally, as cohorts of early childhood teachers graduated with a shared history of training and took up positions across the sector, historical divisions between the sectors disappeared. A new sense of unity emerged. And at the same time, it highlighted how very different working conditions were across the sector, and that raised issues of equity, including equity of pay. The second turning point was the release of the first strategic plan in 2002, and that included 2 major workforce goals. Firstly, that by 2012, all adults working in licensed early childhood teacher-led services would have a benchmark qualification of a 3-year diploma or degree. And secondly, that all teachers had to be registered with the Teachers' Council. And that was via a post-qualification induction program in which graduating teachers were mentored by a registered teacher. The implementation plan for the 10-year strategic plan included a range of financial incentives, including staff scholarships, higher funding rates for centres that met target levels of qualified staff, loans and grants for students, and national and international relocation grants. There was also a systematic professional development program to strengthen teachers' ability to work with the early childhood curriculum, Tafariki. So overall, hopes were really high that the policy infrastructure for early childhood was coming into line with that for the compulsory school sector. By 2004, pay parity for kindergarten teachers and primary school teachers began to be implemented. And that was seen to open the door to pay parity for other people working in the sector. So as a result, within 5 years, the number of qualified staff in early childhood teacher-led centres had grown by 16%. And there were striking improvements in pay across the sector. Unfortunately, though, in 2009, we had a new government and they announced they would no longer pursue the 100% qualified teacher target, and they removed the incentive of the top funding rate for centres with 100% qualified staff. At the same time, the government pursued a policy of increasing child participation, with the result that since 2009, we've seen an ongoing increase in the number of early childhood services, largely in long day types of services, and also an increase in the number of staff employed in early childhood, but also a steady increase in the overall percentage of unqualified staff, with a thinning down of the 80% qualified teachers ban. So while on the face of it, 80% qualified teachers in 96% of teacher-led services looks like we are doing quite well, it's important to note that this is calculated on ratios of under-twos that we want to improve. We are, in fact, significantly short of the expectations of 100% qualified staff by 2012. In April 2018, we had a new Labour-led coalition government, and that set in motion a new 10-year strategic plan. The brief was to strengthen quality and equity and turn back the tide of private provision. The action plan has 5 objectives, which objective 3 focusing on strengthening the workforce. It has 9 actions, with the first being to put the sector back on track to 100% qualified teacher workforce, in effect, righting the wrongs of the last 9 years. The second issue is resolving salary inequities. Award negotiation structures have made pay parity only available to early childhood teachers working in kindergartens. Early childhood teachers with the same qualifications working elsewhere have on average a 24% lower salary. Some have called for a new funding model with salaries for all early childhood teachers paid directly by the Ministry of Education. Related to this, we need a mechanism to ensure public funds are not supporting poor management practices. There's media and research reports showing early childhood teachers under stress from practices including dangerous teacher-child ratios, especially with under 3s. As COVID has unfolded, troubling management behaviors motivated by profit have continued to be reported. Earlier this year, the Education Minister gave the go-ahead to start work on 2 of the actions of the current 10-year action plan, and that's the reinstatement of the higher funding ban for centres employing 100% qualified teachers, and implementing mechanisms to improve the level and consistency of teachers' salary. A new bottom rate salary has been set for all early childhood teachers, irrespective of where they work. A third action to raise the qualifications of home-based educators is also underway. So, hope springs again. But with elections just a few weeks away on the 17th of October, we are also aware that early childhood policy has been a political football for decades, and gains made under one government can be very fragile and unraveled by the next. In our COVID environment, our government has been funding shovel-ready infrastructure projects to keep people employed. Writing with colleagues recently, we've argued that our new 10-year action plan is shovel-ready and needs to be speeded up. Its implementation would give children, families, and communities the best human infrastructure now and for the future. We hope this message will be heard and that we might achieve non-partisan support for the plan and, for once, continuity in early childhood policy.
Well, thank you very much to Carmen, and some glimmers of hope there at the end. And I think we want to hang on to that feeling of hope if we can today. I want to thank all of our speakers for their inputs, and that's generated many questions from our audience today. So I want to turn to our panel as quickly as we can now to try to cover as many of those as we can. And I will try to group them around themes because there is quite a lot of overlap. So our 4 panelists today include the editors, Claire and Peter, who you've already met. And I'm also very pleased to welcome Sara Bonetti, Director of Early Years at the Education Policy Institute, and Beatrice Merrick, Chief Executive of Early Education. please keep putting your questions forward, because we can look at those even outside of this meeting. But I want to now immediately turn to a question from Wendy Scott, if I may. And I'm just going to give Sara a little bit of a warning here, because I might come to you first, Sara. It's around a kind of policy question, policymakers. So how can we persuade policymakers in this country to pay attention to the overwhelming evidence which confirms the personal as well as the financial value of investment in high quality provision in the early years, as demonstrated through Sure Start a generation ago? Sara, what are your immediate thoughts on that? What can we do?
My immediate thought is, as a researcher, I think, of course, this is my biggest frustration point, as I keep reminding policymakers of the same evidence that we are all aware of. I think there is a need, in part, for a reframing, and in part for just keep repeating the message. But also, I think for this message to come more strongly from parents and the younger generation of parents, which should make it a much more hot political issue. And unfortunately, I think that with COVID, we actually took a step backwards, and we're back looking at early years as childcare for all the parents who are at home with young children. But it really, I think a really move forward could be different messengers, and make it very clear that this should not be a political, while education is political, it shouldn't be like a one party versus another. It should be something very much cross-party.
Thanks, Sara. And I want to bring Beatrice in here. For me, there's something about being joined up, united, acting as a community with one voice. And I wonder, Beatrice, if we could hear from you on this issue about persuading policymakers.
Absolutely, and I think the acting with one voice is challenging in a divided sector, and I think government is often good at making the best of that in a divide and rule approach. But I think if we do come together, and if we do present a united front around, and I think COVID actually has made a lot of private and voluntary sector providers feel that they are providing a public service but not being treated as a public service. And so I think there is a sort of momentum for change that perhaps we need to seize, and perhaps we also need to stress that to parents as well, who have been losing this service and perhaps would rather see it as a public service than as a fragmented, marketized one. So perhaps those are the things that we need to seize right now.
To hear that. I think we the idea of community and joined upness is something that was characteristic, I believe, in New Zealand many years ago in getting their curriculum model and getting the kind of diverse voices represented. So maybe there's something we can learn from that, and we're not quite getting right here. So thanks for that. Now I want to move on to Polly Crowther's question here. And I think this is probably for Claire and Peter in the first instance. And Polly asks, what practical steps can ordinary people, parents and practitioners? Now, Polly, I know what you mean by ordinary, but there's nothing ordinary about a parent or a practitioner. Let me tell you that right now. But how can we make the book's proposals a reality? So Claire or Peter, would you like to start with that?
Peter?
Well, yes. I think at one level, there's a very basic need to have these issues being discussed. What do we want for our children? And what are the possibilities that exist? And what do we think of the system that we have at present? At present, I think there's been a sense that there is no alternative, that we've got what we've got and we can't do much about it. But that's clearly not the case, as our book shows very strongly that there are alternatives and they're perfectly feasible. You can't do them tomorrow, but like anything over a period of 10 or 15 years, you could build a quite different system. But I think the starting point has to be people actually themselves beginning to change their expectations and their hopes for the future, rather than believe that all they can possibly do is to tweak the present unsatisfactory system. So to repeat myself, I would just say a starting point is to have discussions opening up at all sorts of levels, from a school right through to a local authority or whatever, under the heading, what do we want for our children?
Thank you, Peter. Claire, would you like to add anything to that response?
Only to say that, yes, I think it has to be bottom up. It is a political field. Our politicians are there to represent us, and we can start at neighbourhood and local levels. Councils are interested in supporting, in my experience, are interested in supporting families, and we should be talking to them and raising the issue of how can you actually combine bringing up your child with work in this current day and age. And we do pay taxes, and we would like some support with that. And this is what it might look like.
And finally, to Diana, who also wrote about democracy. I mean, in terms of how we can put this into sort of practical realities, have you got any suggestions for Polly?
I think they're not very dissimilar from some of the things that we've discussed here now. The aspect of community and actually having a joint wish to make something happen is the first thing, I would say. For example, the example I gave from the modern school movement started with 6 teachers joining to develop their learning and their thinking together. And today there's more than 2,000 people actually joining together with the same objective. So having a common objective and actually believing that democracy is possible and thinking about what does that mean for the specific context and spaces in which we work, I would say are the first things to think about.
Very much. Hopefully, Polly, that's given you some food for thought, but we probably do need to keep talking about this as a community of early childhood educators and parents. So I'm going to move us on now to a topic that's come up in several different ways in different questions, and it's really around children's centres. And we've heard already about Sure Start and children's centres as being hubs within the community. The question is also linked to local authorities, and maybe we need to do much more at the local level. And I think that's been quite a strong point. So a question from Mona Sakir. Can we say more on the idea of local authorities providing children's centres through non-profit providers? And who would these providers be? Beatrice, can I put you on the spot for this one?
Sure. Well, at the moment, a lot of children's centres are run by large charities such as Action for Children. So they are run by not-for-profit. Whether that's the model one wants to go down, there's also a strong argument that those which were run by nursery schools were incredibly effective, and having that integration between the work of the children's centre and the work of the nursery schools brings together those education, care and community links in an incredibly powerful way. So I think there are lots of models that we can look at, but certainly that local decision making and that local responsiveness is really important. But there is the issue in recent years that it's much more led to a postcode lottery, where whether you have any children's centres at all has been down to local decisions. So striking a balance between a centrally mandated level of service that everyone should have, but the freedom to deliver it locally according to local needs, I think is the tricky thing.
Thanks, Beatrice. And following on from that, Sara, you might want to add to that, but also to try and make us think also about how the workforce is positioned within this. If we were to move to a much more community-based children's centres, your work on the professional learning and so on, and workforce development, what insights could you share with us in relation to that?
Well, I'm a big supporter of things happening at local authority level. Unfortunately, England has followed quite a backward path compared to other countries, whereby they've taken away control and funding from local authorities. So I would be all for going back to local authority, providing that the resources are also put back. And nothing against a national oversight, because I think one of the criticism that came to Sure Start and children's centres was that there was too much variety in how things were done. So, but there can be a different model about national level framework and actual local implementation. And plugging in about the workforce, I've had many conversations with local authorities, and it is clear that they are in the best position to know who their workforce is, above all when it comes to children's centers and health and education and family services integrated. That is really only a local reality. So that's where you can really understand what your needs are in terms of professional development. You're not going to move cross country to do a CPD training. So really having the local authorities being able to not control, but to have the information and link up providers would be very helpful.
Peter or Claire, do you want to comment on this, the kind of children's centre? I know a lot of work you've done looking at this as a model. Anything to add on that?
Actually, the Institute of Education through Thomas Coram Research Unit was one of the first places to open children's centres in this country back in the 1970s. So we have a very long and fond connection with this model. And the sad thing about it is, instead of being taken as the basis for a universal system, it ended up becoming rather targeted and added to the existing hodgepodge of services that we've got. So we're really saying we want to see early childhood education in the future being developed through universal children's centres. And those centres, I think, yes, there's a role for non-profit organisations, and as Beatrice has said, that already exists. There are plenty of models. Cooperatives would be another one. But we also want to see local authorities going back to being the providers of some of these services, because they have in the past been able to provide some really rather good early childhood services. So the local authority would both be a provider and through that actually learn about early childhood education, but also be a support for the whole system, including, for example, as you see in places like Reggio Emilia, providing really important professional development programs, general support to workers and centres, and generally encouraging cooperation rather than competition, so that people are exchanging experience and so forth.
Claire in a moment, but I just want to intersect a comment from Gary Todd on this very issue about, whether you've considered the challenge of local government childcare delivery, because there clearly will be challenges around it. So just to add that into the mix, Claire, could I ask you to comment on that?
Local, as far as the workforce is concerned, in that if we could get the teaching unions to take an interest in early childhood education and to drive up a model of a teacher-based or a social pedagogue-based qualification that would be acceptable everywhere, that would have common understanding, that would have a holistic approach, then that would be a quality assurance mechanism for wherever you sent your child to a children's centre. And it would start to raise standards everywhere and equalise things. I think we need a combination of both the very local and the national here to be able to regulate and to also upgrade the conditions of work of people who work in children's centres or other provision.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. And I can see Sara nodding there. So, yeah. Did you want to add a final comment on that topic?
Just a disclaimer, where I was really fascinated to hear, all the history related to New Zealand progress. And one key concept that really struck me was this movement away from childcare to teacher, which I'm one of the big supporters. And yet, you hear a lot of resistance from early years professionals about being called teachers in England. So I think there's a strong cultural conversation that needs to be had. And it probably comes from, like a distorted or a negative view of schooling that then goes into early years. But it does remind us that context matters.
Thanks very much. So I think we've got time for one more question. Then I'm going to ask panel members to give me a kind of answer to a question in one sentence, but I'll save that for when I've just given. This is a question I think for Diana actually. I think just quoting you, Diana, education is a shared journey towards active democratic citizenship. Hopefully you recognise that. And the question comes from Nikki Wallace. And the question is, how would our practice develop if we came back to this as our starting point?
It's a good question. And I think we cannot see these things in isolation. I think everything we spoke about is democracy. So the workforce, the teacher qualification, looking at, how we have a devised system, these can all be considered questions of democracy. So in order to actually think about democratic citizenship, and that's why I reinforce so much the connection between education and society, I think part of the basis for having these discussions is actually seeing it as a whole and trying to address the different issues with the connections and relationships that they have. So it's not only about gaining more qualifications, but it's understanding what those qualifications are for and what the purposes of early childhood education are for. And I think this is the political question that we see many times, for example, in Peter's book, which is the big question, what is the purpose of early childhood education? And I think this is the basis for our discussions about democracy and democratic citizenship. And it's definitely something, and going back to the quote, it's definitely something that we need to go back to, but we need to search within ourselves, what does that mean? And one of the things that I've been quite interested about is how democracy can actually take many different forms depending on the context in which we are immersed, and what does that mean for what we need, and also what does that mean for a culture of early childhood education that it's a culture of community, and it's not thinking about democracy as something where we have the school walls that divide the democratic school from the community. It's about how we can see it as a shared journey and commitment.
Thank you very much. And we are coming towards the end of our time, but I just want to throw a question out to all the panel members, and I'll go along one by one just to get a sentence from you. And I guess the question is this, going back to Polly's question about how can we realize this in practice, and it must make a difference, so what would be your one message to policymakers who might be on the call? I don't know, but if they are, I'll give you a few seconds to think about that. I mean, for me, it is very much about, we need joined up thinking. We need to work together as a community. And I think we've been wanting that, certainly for the 30 years that I've been working in early childhood education. And I would love to see some real progress on this. We have made some progress. There is hope, but maybe we can do more. And this is going to start that conversation again and go into all of our networks. And hopefully we will connect as we leave this meeting. So I wonder is anyone ready to give their response? Key message for policymakers here, or shall I just pick on somebody? Who's okay? Brilliant, thank you.
I think I'll repeat a message that I often have. Children before they start reception year are the same children that then suddenly turn out into reception year classes, and they deserve your focus and your respect since day one, rather than just as they suddenly turn into mandatory school.
Thank you very much, Sara. Powerful message, very succinct. Thank you. Who would like to volunteer next?
Okay,
well, I had, Sue, I had something really similar, which is that a plea for humanitarian values that value children and parenting, to realise the connection between children and parenting and the rest of society, and to support them in their education. It is our future.
Thank you very much, Claire. Excellent. And Who would like to go next? Beatrice?
Sure. I think I would like to say to policymakers, the question you're trying to answer is the wrong question. I think this book really powerfully shows us how we need to reframe our thinking about what the important questions are. And I think that's particularly true around the chapters around curriculum and measurement and the focus on entirely the wrong things. So let's change the debate around those.
Thank you, Beatrice. And then that leaves Diana or Peter. Diana, can I come to you next?
Yes. I would say that in line with what has been said so far, I would pass a message that perhaps we need to broaden our definitions of education. Education is not only what can be measured. Education is not only what comes in the books. Education is not only what is defined in an office, in a round table, between people that are not many times in the educational environment. So I would think very, very carefully about what we mean by education and what does that mean for the people living it every day in their lives.
Thank you, Diana. Brilliant. And Peter, final word to you.
Right, I'm going to pick an issue from the book and final chapter. I would say to them, risk opening a democratic politics of education around key questions. What do we want for our children? What is our image of the child? What is the purpose of education? And what are its fundamental values? We need to open up to a rethinking which will enable us then to decide what we should do to bring it about.
Excellent. Brilliant messages. My warm thanks to all of you and also for the invitation to be here today. It's fantastic to chair such an important and lively debate. My thanks to the audience, to the questions and to the technology team who've kept us going. I hope you'll continue this debate outside of this meeting and we can all start to connect over these really important issues. So thank you very much and I wish you a very good day. Thank you.